streets with my address, yeah. Cold nights, I must confess, yeah. But something in my soul that kept telling me to hold on. Even when the world turned its back on me, I knew deep inside that I wasn't meant to be bad.
Welcome to When I Was Homeless, a podcast that shares real stories of resilience and hope. I'm your host, Gabby Cunningham, and today we're having an honest conversation about homelessness, not as statistics, but as human experiences. Each story matters, each voice deserves to be heard, and each guest brings us closer to understanding. Today, we are speaking with Clare, all the way from the UK. Clare, thank you for joining us today from across the pond in the UK. What's the weather like today?
It's been quite dull here. Our temperatures are getting colder now, so I think it's probably been about 12 degrees. It's just dull and wet, really. Nothing unusual for the UK.
And what part of the UK are you actually in, if you don't mind me asking?
Not at all. So I'm from a place just outside Manchester, which is in the north of the UK. So I live in Wigan.
I know that there in Wigan, you are doing some phenomenal work. Before we get into your story, would you mind sharing with us what you're doing and how you're positively impacting your community?
Yeah, so I set up my own business, the Anger Management Coach, and I help people to overcome their emotions. So we quite often ride the wave of our emotions, don't we? So I like to think it as calming their storms and allowing them to live a better life where they are communicating better with relationships, whether that's in home life or in work life. I am also supporting a homeless project, which is in the Greater Manchester area. I go in there every other week and do workshops with whoever wants to turn up on the day and talk to them about how they feel, how talking to professionals makes them feel and how they'd like to feel. That's very early in this project, though, so I'm trying to break down barriers, really. But it's been absolutely amazing to have been accepted to go in there in the first place. I'm also hopefully about to start working with people going through criminal law proceedings and helping them to manage their anger as well.
Oh my gosh, that sounds like an exciting program. I mentioned to you that this is a judgment-free zone. It's a safe zone, and your story matters. I am going to give you the floor. I want to know, can you take us back to that evening when your first experience with homelessness began?
Yeah. So I was at home and my son, who was probably about 14, he had gone, so it was school holidays, and he had gone to Blackpool where my parents lived, which was about 2 hours away, about an hour and a half from where I lived at the time. So he'd gone to have a holiday with them. And I was at home with my then partner. And it was quite a turbulent relationship because, and I'm not making any excuses, I had been unfaithful to that partner. And I absolutely know that's wrong. But I had done. And that partner had several then kind of hang-ups, I guess, about me, and were very much filtered on everything that I did, looking for, is she being unfaithful again? Excuse me. So I was working from home that day and my computer was all set up, and I had left my computer in the front room. I had gone downstairs. I'd made tea. We'd eaten tea together. And I'd then gone back downstairs to wash up. When I came back upstairs, my partner just kind of turned and said, "You need to leave." Oh no, I'd said something along the lines of, "Have you heard from Sam?" Sam was the person who I had been unfaithful with. I said something along the lines of no, because I hadn't. And My ex-partner was like, you need to leave. And I was like very confused because I didn't understand why I was being told to leave. Because as far as I was concerned, in that moment, everything was okay. It turned out that they had gone onto my laptop and they had gone on to Facebook Messenger. They had seen a message that I had sent, not to that other person, but to a friend of theirs. And they, for whatever reason, and all I'd said was, would it be possible to have a chat with you? So they kind of blew that out of all proportion and said, you need to get out. So I just thought, you know what, I'm not going to stand here and argue that point because I clearly wasn't going anywhere with that. I guess part of me also thought, do you know, I can't do anything right in this relationship. So part of me was kind of like, right, I just need to go. I'm not standing here arguing anymore. And so they said, get out. I packed a bag of clothes and kind of got in the car. And my head was thinking, what am I going to do? Because I lived quite a distance away from work anyway. I lived about a 45-minute drive away from where I worked. And my parents lived an hour and a half in the complete other direction. So I got in the car and I knew that I was going to have to drive the hour and a half away from work or away from home to my parents, and then get up the next morning and drive that kind of 2.5-hour journey to get to work. So I just got in the car and all the time I was thinking, I'm due to go to Nigeria in a month. What on earth am I going to do? I had so much going through my head. I had my son who was at school or was being schooled in that area. Now I had nowhere to live. So what was I going to do about my son's school? What was I going to do about work? What was I now going to do about having to go to Nigeria? So it was literally like throwing all of those balls in the air and thinking, right, what do I do? How am I going to manage this? Because I just didn't know what to do. So I spent that car journey, that hour and a half, of just trying to juggle those balls in the air as to, right, what do I do? How do I tell my parents that I've got nowhere to live? How do I tell my son that we've got nowhere to live? And what do I do about my employer? So it was a very, very difficult moment, or hour and a half, should I say.
Right. For sure, it would have had to been. And so I guess I would like to know, what did you tell your parents when you got there? What was that experience like for you? And were they able to help you problem solve that? Was it a difficult conversation? What was that like for you?
It was awful because at the time I had a gambling addiction, and we had found that the medication that I'd been prescribed to take by my doctor had significant side effects. And those side effects were of obsessive compulsive behaviors. One in particular being, and it was even written on the, I can't think of the word, on the
Label?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, on the leaflet that you get with the medication, it was there. One of the significant side effects was of prolific or problematic gambling. And it had hit me like a brick. So I knew that I had this. So I was struggling financially as well. I think my parents were aware that I had a gambling addiction, but they never said anything. On top of all of this, my dad had been diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and he had been undergoing chemotherapy for cancer. I think that started, so he'd been He'd had chemotherapy for about 2 years prior, and he wasn't a well man. His heart was in failure. He wasn't a well man. So I knew that I was driving to my parents, who were already having significant issues, and I was taking a carload of issues to them. So I had to turn up with a solution, was my mind. I think I rang them on my way there and said, look, I'm coming and I've got nowhere to live, so I'm going to be on your doorstep. So I think on the way there, I also thought, what am I going to do about work? So what do I do in the bigger picture? I think the bigger picture, I made that to be that my employer was about to undertake a 4-month contract for a United Nations contract in Nigeria. So I knew that I was going to go out there for at least 1 month. I was due to come home for a month, and then I was due to go back to Nigeria for another month. So in my mind, I thought, well, if I go to Nigeria for the 4-month contract, then that gives me 4 months to find somewhere to live near to where I'm employed. And in the meantime, whilst it's absolutely not ideal and it meant that I would be separated from my son, I knew that my son would be safe. And that was the most important thing for me, was my son would be safe. He would be being looked after by my parents. He could help my mum to care for my dad. And I could get him in a school where my parents lived, because we'd already lived there anyway, prior to moving away. So I kind of turned up with my parents with this whole, that basically of, right, I'll just go and live in Nigeria for 4 months. Work will, in my mind, work will just go with that because I've gone to them with a solution. So that's basically what I turned up with. And I know it wasn't ideal. And I know there are probably people listening thinking, oh my God, why would you even turn your back on your son? But life doesn't come with these great suggestions, and life doesn't come with just a beautiful bow, and it's amazing. I was in an awful, awful predicament, and I had to find a solution. And I now know, looking back, it wasn't the best solution, but I just didn't know what to do. And I am literally, as this is almost a therapeutic thing, saying this out loud, because I guess this is the first time I've ever said any of this out loud, because it was such a hard thing to acknowledge and a hard thing to go through, to have to say to my son, I've let you down. The hardest part of it was to have to put that to my son and say to him, this is what I need to do. I need to go and live elsewhere. I need to put you back in a school that you're going to be hundreds of miles away from me. And essentially what that also meant was that because my son was so close to finishing his high school years, was that it wasn't just 4 months that I would be away. It meant that for 18 months, my son would live with my parents until he was at an age where he could leave school and come back to live with me. In the meantime, I could continue to be employed and could get a roof over our heads. In the same time, manage and get out of a gambling addiction. So that is what I then went to do.
Wow. There's a couple of things I want to touch on. First, I want to know about how you overcame your gambling addiction, but I also want to know, how did your son receive that? Now that you're further removed, have you guys had conversations where he shared what he went through? Would you like to touch on that at all?
Yeah, I spoke to Harry, my son, and I spoke to my parents. And I said to them, look, I think this is the best thing. And I think they perhaps just went along with it. I mean, my mum said to me, my mum's in her 80s, so she would have been in her early 70s then. She said, well, I'll just come and live with you over in Yorkshire. Just get a flat and I'll live there. And I think my mum thought that I could literally just walk into an estate agent's, find somewhere to live the next day, and it would be that simple. Obviously, I knew it wouldn't be. So there was kind of managing those expectations. The hardest thing was I managed to speak to social services to get this whole thing sorted, because I literally had to say to them, I'm homeless. I've had to flee, what essentially, I guess, in some respect was domestic abuse, because I was being psychologically abused in some respect, but I don't know. Now I'm saying it out loud. But anyway, I had to say to them, you need to get my son a place in school. And the hardest bit was when my dad dropped me at the train station to go to Nigeria. I had my suitcase and I gave my son a kiss goodbye. My son was clearly very visibly upset. I gave my dad a kiss goodbye, looking at my dad and thinking, are you still going to be here when I get home? As you can imagine, it was so upsetting to think that, wow, if ever life hits you and says you need to change how you're living your life, Claire, that's that moment when you don't know if you're going to ever see your parent again. And when am I going to see my son again? Harry and I have chatted since, because obviously 18 months went and a lot of things went on in those 18 months. My dad passed away, unfortunately. I have sat down and spoken to my son, and he has said that it was awful, Mum. Those times were absolutely awful. But look at where you are now. I am so privileged to have the most amazing relationship with my son and his girlfriend. I'm getting married next week and my son is going to be my witness. We went shopping for our outfits this weekend and he was there and he was just so proud to be part of that. And I'm so incredibly proud of where he is in life. He works for the local police force. I'm so incredibly proud of him, because he could have gone completely off the rails because of me, and he hasn't. And that's because of him.
First of all, congratulations. That's amazing.
Thank you.
And also give yourself some credit, because while there may be some listeners who question your decision-making, I think that when we do these really hard things, like going across the ocean for such a long stretch of time and such an integral part of our children's development, that is not taken lightly. We're absolutely doing that with our children in mind. Mm-hmm. And although you sadly lost your father and your son was there to witness that experience and those things, I do believe that it made him stronger. I do believe that it gave him such an appreciation for the time he got to spend with your parents, but also for the sacrifice you made for both of your futures. So definitely give yourself some credit, because
thank you.
Being a mom does not come with a handbook. Yeah. Being homeless or having your situation change on a dime, no one prepares for that.
Yeah.
And we just do the best that we can. I would like to know, how did you overcome this medication-induced gambling addiction? Did that happen while you were still in the UK? Were you in Nigeria?
So I went to Nigeria, and as you can imagine, for me, I felt like I'd lost my world. I'd literally went to Nigeria with nothing, and other than my work colleagues, and one particular work colleague, Kelly, who I sat next to her on the flight as we were going over, and it was the most surreal flight, because my friend was watching Bridget Jones and she was crying watching Bridget Jones. I think it was when Bridget Jones was pregnant or something. She was crying. Somebody fell over on the aircraft and was having some sort of medical emergency. And it just made me cry because I was flying away from my family. I just thought, what have I left? And what if my dad's not there when I go back? So it was horrible. It was let's just put it this way, it was 4 months of thinking about life. And unfortunately, because I was still taking the medication whilst I was in Nigeria, I was still gambling. And I remember saying to my dad, can I send you some money? Because I wanted to get rid of the money so that I couldn't gamble it. And I thought, if I send my dad the money, then I don't have access to it. I can't gamble. My dad just turned round and said, well, I asked him for his bank details and he said, no, I'm not prepared to give it you. And I was like, why? I just want to send you the money. He was like, well, no, because what if you're in Nigeria? What if, the money vanishes from my account? Because over in the UK, I don't know if it's what it's like in the US, there's a lot of Nigerian scams. So my dad just put Claire's in Nigeria, so there's going to be a bank scam going on here. I couldn't save my money because my dad wouldn't allow me to give it to him. So anyway, I got home from Nigeria in the July, and whilst I was in Nigeria, I was able to find somewhere to live back in the UK, not far from where I lived. It was what you would call a trailer park. So it was what we call a static caravan. It was in the most beautiful surroundings, and it was in the countryside. There was an old stately home in the grounds of this, or the static caravan was in the grounds of a stately home. When that stately home was closed to the public, you can imagine, I just had, and it wasn't just me that lived there, there was a lot of other people lived there, but we had the run of the stately home grounds. It was beautiful. It was just the most amazing place to live and to kind of reflect on, I need to be in a better place. I need to be better for my son. I had to move out of there in the December because it was due to close, and I was due to move in with one of my work colleagues. And as I was packing up the caravan to go and move in with my work colleague, my brother rang me. My brother never ever rang me. And he said to me, Dad's passed away. And my dad passed away the day after his 74th birthday. And we had expected it, but it doesn't take away how much that hurts. I just remember, again, driving back to my parents' home, my car, again, full of all of my belongings, and turning up. And what I now realised was the glue to our family. My dad had passed away. I felt completely alone because I had no significant person in my life then. My dad had gone. I was still gambling. I still had these obsessive compulsive behaviours and feelings. Life just was still not great. We said goodbye to my dad. His funeral was on the 21st of December. In that January of 2018, I was going through a significant surgery. I was having spinal surgery. We just said goodbye to my dad. I remember after the surgery, and I was several hours away from my mum and from Harry, and I'd undergone the surgery. I remember sitting on this hospital bed and thinking, life's got to change, Claire. Because you're sitting here, you're hundreds of miles away from the only two people in your life that matter, that can't come and visit you. There's nobody else here visiting you, Claire. You cannot carry on life like this. So I made the decision there and then that I needed to go and speak to the doctor about the medication. I needed to refer to the gambling clinic. So I was scared to go to the doctor. I was scared of judgment. So it's really good when you started this podcast by saying this is a place of non-judgment, because the biggest part of being homeless, of any addiction, of any negative behavior is people finding out and being judged. And that was what my fear of going to speak to the doctor was, how are they going to judge me? So rather than going to speak to my own GP, I referred myself to the NHS, so our health scheme here, the National Health Service. And I was spoken to by a neurologist and then a psychologist, and they basically said, it's the medication that's doing it, Claire. You need to go and speak to your GP and you need to be taken off that medication. So a GP here, general practitioner, that's my doctor. So the gambling clinic said they would write to my GP, give it a few weeks and go and speak to the GP, and we will ask them to take you off that medication. So I left it a couple of weeks. I went and spoke to my GP very nervously, went into the waiting room, into their surgery, and said to them, I'd like you to take me off this medication, please. I believe it's that's causing me to have this horrible gambling addiction. I'm losing just about everything. And the doctor just simply said, I'm the doctor with your care. I'm the one who says whether you get referred to a neurologist or not. As far as I'm concerned, you need to decide whether you can manage the gambling addiction or your restless legs. And that was as much as the conversation went. He gave me no help. It just went silent. That was it. There was no help. He just said, you need to make the choice. You either can control the restless legs or you can control the gambling. And I just felt so unheard and so judged. I remember the walk back home, and I just remember thinking, why did I just even bother? And the concern for me as well was, now that I've raised my head above the parapet, that will be on my medical record. So now I'm going to have something on my medical record that says I have an addiction, but actually you haven't helped me with it. And I honestly just thought, what is the point in life? Why am I here? Because I'm not managing this. I'm not being a good parent. I'm juggling balls and not juggling them very well. I just thought, what is the point? Why am I bothering? My why was my son. My why for being around in life was my son. I just thought, that boy has been through so much, Claire. And when I say that, I mean it not in comparison to anybody else's life, because I know realistically there are people who've been through far worse. And I'm not trying to belittle that, I guess. But for me, I just thought, you've put him through so much. You are not putting him through losing a parent. He was my why. He was my why for carrying on in life and just putting one foot in front of the other. I think I might have jumped in time there, because I remember it was then that my dad then passed away, and then I had the surgery, and it was then that I thought, you need to go back to the doctor. So I think my time frame may have got mixed up there. But I remember as Harry was due to leave school, I had moved house, so I had saved money, and it's really funny because I've written a chapter in a book, a collaboration about this very subject. It says, hear that again, I saved money. I had a gambling addiction, but I saved money. I saved money for a house deposit, and I managed to get and secure a house rental that was close to where my son was going to be going to college. So I got my son signed up to go to college. I got the house, and we didn't have much furniture, but we had furniture. It was ours. I wasn't living in a caravan as much as I loved that. My son was living back with me. I had the most important person in the world back in my life. We'd moved house. It meant that we had to move doctors as well. I remember going to see this new doctor, and I had to have a medication review. I thought, well, Claire, this is your opportunity. This is your time to go back and ask again. Don't take no for an answer now. So I remember going and sitting in that doctor's surgery and thinking again, you know, we've got to do this better now, Claire. You've got to stand up for yourself. I remember going in to speak to the doctor, and it was a lovely little Asian lady. She sat there and with the widest beam said, "Hi, Claire, how are you?" I just instantly felt better. I was instantly like, oh my gosh, she's seen me. I explained to her that the medication that I was taking had this serious side effect, that there should be a letter somewhere on my notes. She instantly just reached for the medical book and prescribed me a new medication without batting an eyelid. There was no judgment. There was no, you're causing me a problem. You're making me have to look. You're making me have to think about this. It was just yeah, of course I can do that. I walked out of that surgery with a new prescription for a new medication that absolutely turned my life around, because within weeks, that gambling addiction had gone. So the medication had been affecting the dopamine levels in my brain. So, of course, the habit of just picking up my phone and gambling, that was still there. So I had to get rid of that, but that was easy. Once the dopamine and etc. had been sorted out in my brain and I was put on a different medication, that was easy, because the absolute will and determination to get this right for my son was there. And that's the conversation that I have with Harry now, is that look at where we are, Harry. Look at how different life is. And for Harry's 21st birthday, we all went to New York, and I paid for him to go to New York. And I was so proud of that. I even said to him whilst we were in New York, and I said to him, look, Harry, let's have a little bit of a celebration and a look at how far away from gambling I am, but also how far away from gambling your life is now and how different it is. And he acknowledged that as well. He said, you're doing so well, and life's so different now, Mum.
You are doing well. That is amazing. It's a beautiful story. How did these experiences lead to your current work in NLP and coaching? How has those experiences translated into the incredible work you're doing today?
I think it's allowed me to put myself in somebody else's shoes, and it allows me to be there as a non-judgmental, because that is so important to me, is to turn up and be real, and to turn up and not sit with somebody who, so I've worked with, I started to work with men in domestic abuse circumstances, so male perpetrators of domestic abuse, but I didn't want to sit there in judgment of them, because my job was to help them change their behaviour and to go from a negative behaviour to a more positive, enriched life where they could communicate rather than anger communicate, and then not live a peaceful life. So it was important that I sat alongside them, not holding a position of power over them, but literally just sitting and being on a journey with them whilst they looked at their behaviours and acknowledged their behaviours, and not me pointing at those behaviours and saying, this is what you're doing wrong and this is how you should be living your life. Because who am I to tell them that? Look at what I've done in my life. I can't tell somebody how they should live their lives because, as you said earlier, we don't come into life with any book of how we should live life. We learn. Life is just a journey. It's a learning curve. It's an education. So I like to think that when I started working with male perpetrators of domestic abuse, my having gone through domestic abuse in another relationship and having gone through homelessness and just being in that raw moment, I was able to see I could make such a huge difference just by listening and just being sat in that moment with them, so they knew there was someone there to support them. And that is all I try to do. Is when I was working with people, I saw the huge impact that this thing called NLP, that I never even knew existed, but it was having a huge impact on people. And I thought, you know what? I want to be part of that. I want that in my life. So again, I'm going to use this huge word that somebody who's had a gambling addiction, I'm really proud to say I invested in myself. I paid money. I paid thousands of pounds to invest and become certificated as an NLP practitioner and then as an NLP coach, so that I can help and I can go forward and use my experiences in life. So that is how it's helped me, is that I can just move forward and I can just be sat with somebody. I can sit alongside people. And as I quite often say to people, and it says it, I support people on their path to change. I tell them that we're going to start like point A on their journey, and I will literally walk alongside them on the pathway, and I'll open the gates and I'll support them as they go on that journey, and we'll have conversations on that journey. But it's realistically their journey, and I'm privileged to be part of it, I guess.
Absolutely. I so resonate with that. Having this podcast, it's a blessing. It's a gift to me. I feel privileged to do this work because, as you say, just sitting and listening, it's powerful. And it was my own experience with homelessness that brought me here, right?
Yeah.
I thought as a community health nurse, I understood what it was like and what it meant to be homeless. It wasn't until I was in a very specific situation myself that I realized, no, it's so nuanced and there's so much more to it. My question for you is, how has your perspective on homelessness changed through your journey? I noticed that you share a lot about how your mindset changed and how you've grown, your relationship with your son has improved.
I think so. I mean, I spent 20 years as a police officer. And so I think my being a police officer, so I would often deal with people who were homeless. And you even hear that word in deal with. So we'd get calls from people saying that there's a homeless person sleeping in their shop doorway, or they've urinated in the doorway, or, and we would be called to deal with that person. There generally wasn't much that we could do because I policed in what was a very well-known seaside resort called Blackpool, which is in the north of England. There was very little homeless shelters for people to go to. So quite often people who were homeless, we were dealing with them because they might have been shoplifting or stealing, because they were in such a dire position. They didn't want to shoplift. They were hungry. They were, trying to get money for, perhaps they had a drug addiction, perhaps they had alcoholism. They were dealing with, the awful end of the stick that life was giving them. And I think when I first started in the police, I was only 20. I was effectively a very young child. Well, not a young child, but a young adult who didn't know anything about life. And when I look at my perspective of homelessness in the police, where it's horrible to see it, like it's, and I'm using hashtags, I know you can't see it, but it's a problem that police need to deal with. Whereas I now, as Clare Bradley, see homelessness as a societal problem that people aren't being cared for. I was delivering a workshop a couple of weeks ago, and one of the chaps within the homeless house, he said, I have a drug addiction. They give me appointments to go and speak to my drug worker, but they give me appointments on days when I'm trying to source the drugs. And they don't understand that my addiction, the impact that addiction is having on me. And when I trying desperately to source the money or the drugs, etc., then I'm not going to my appointments. And then they are putting restrictions on me because I'm not meeting their standards. And that's like, absolutely, we might have drug addiction services, but the standards are not achievable for those with the addictions. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. There are so many gaps in the supports. That's why I think it's important we have these conversations, because the gaps exist, but we're looking at things from a broad perspective, a broad point of view, and we really need to zoom in, which is what you do. So can you tell us a little bit more about what you're currently doing, how you're helping your community, and even tell us where we can find you on the web? Just tell us more about you and your now.
Yeah, so my now is, I decided quite quickly in March that I'd had enough of being employed, that if they were paying me to be a behaviour change facilitator, then I could do that. They're paying me to do it. So I became a behaviour change coach, which is effectively the anger management coach. So I set up the anger management coach to help people change their emotions, because that's what anger is, to be able to get through things in life, to use perspectives. And I was recently networking, and there in the room was the operations manager for a homeless housing association, which is Adula Homes. They looked at me and said, we would love to work with you. I looked at them and said, I would love to work with you, because I just thought, what an amazing place to be able to help the traumas that people who are homeless, that they have gone through. The amount of trauma must be absolutely huge. Will be having such an impact on their abilities to get homes, to stay in homes, to get through addictions, to get into employment. It's massive. So we had a chat, we went on to have a meeting, and I am now absolutely thrilled to be able to be going in and doing work with them. It is very, very new as a project, but I am going in and supporting their service users by simply sitting down, every other week and talking to them. But more importantly, listening, hoping to take that even further as a service with them. As an anger management coach, I do one-to-one coaching. I have private clients. I can work with people in all sorts of ways. I have lawyers who I'm currently talking with about their clients who have gone through anger management problems, people who have domestic abuse issues in relation to they can't manage their anger. So people can find me on the internet at www.angermanagementcoach.co.uk. On Facebook, via Clare Bradley. Just simply look me up and you will find me there. And my email is on the Anger Management Coach website.
Thank you so much for that. Before we go, I did just want to share with our listeners that UK homelessness affects approximately 325,000 people in 2024. That's a lot of people. And professional homelessness is often invisible, but increasingly common. And earlier in your story, I wanted to ask, you were 2 hours away from your job, if my math is correct. What was it like for you the day that you went to work after leaving? I just want to know what that may have looked like, because a lot of people who identify as homeless or houseless or in housing instability, they are professionals, they are working. And I think that it's important to discuss what people may be feeling in that situation, even when they show up for work.
It was awful. I just remember, so bearing in mind, I'd literally driven for hours the night before to get to my parents, to then I had to be at work for 8:30 in the morning. And it was quite a distance away. And I have a real issue with being late. So I would always try and get to work for 8:00 in the morning. So I've now got at least a 2-hour drive, which would be rush hour. So I'd probably got up about 4:00. I can't remember. I probably wouldn't have had much sleep, thinking about what am I going to do, thinking as well. I was also very worried about what my employer would think. Am I letting them down? I'd only been there, how long had I been there? 2 years, I think. I just felt a lot of pressure. And so I remember just driving there. I don't think I've slept very much. I walked in and my colleague, Kelly, who had helped me so much, she was there and she just saw me and could clearly say that I hadn't slept, that I wasn't in a good place, and saw me and said, "What on earth?" And I think I just burst out crying. And she kind of took me to one side. It was a very, very small company that I worked for. And as is quite the common now, it was all very open plan. So probably everybody saw that there's Claire, she's upset. And I was one of the trainers as well. So people had specific roles in that employment. So again, there's Claire, there's one of the trainers. Why is she crying? Before long, the assistant training manager was sat next to me going, "What's wrong?" I had to just spill it all out and, say, "This is what's happened." And I just remember just saying, I can feel the shaking. I can feel my body was probably shaking. And I just said to her, "I might as well just go to Nigeria for 4 months. It's just easier. Just send me." I think part of me, my body was praying that they would just say yes, because that for me meant that at least I still had an income. At least I still had a job. I know that the gambling was there, but at least I was still in employment and I wasn't going to be homeless and unemployed. I just remember speaking to them and my boss said to me, "Just go home. Just go home. I'll speak to the senior management team we'll have a chat. I remember thinking, I have just travelled 2 hours to get here so that I'm on time, which is mad, thinking about everything that's going on. But I desperately needed to be at work on time. I desperately needed to be at work in my clean uniform, looking tidy, looking like I hadn't slept in a car or whatever. You know what I mean? I was there, I was tidy, I was presentable. Now you're sending me home, where realistically, I don't have a home. And I've now got to have to drive all that way back because I haven't got anywhere else to go. I remember I got in my car and Kelly had said to me, have you got any money? I was like, no, I've got nothing. She said to me, look, if we end up going to Nigeria for 4 months, I will get all of your toiletries. Don't worry about that. I'll sort that. As I was driving back to my parents, one of the senior management team rang me. And I just remember his conversation was, look, Claire, I completely understand what's happening. This has happened to me before. I remember I ended up driving back to my dad when I split up with my wife. I don't want you to make any rash decisions. I want you to go home. I want you to speak to your parents, speak to your son, see if 4 months away in Nigeria is right. If it's right, then get back to me and we will sort it and we will send you there for 4 months. But make sure it's right with your family. In the meantime, do you need money? Because if you do, we will put money in your bank account and we will make sure everything's fine. And I got home. We had another chat with my parents, with my son. I then got a text message from another senior management. It was just a text message to say, everything will be fine. Do not worry, we have got you. My employers were all ex-military. I got the impression then that they had literally cradled me and they were carrying me. But within, I don't know how many hours, there was a significant amount of money deposited into my bank account from the employer to get me through, because they knew that I'd got no money. They didn't know about the gambling addiction, but they knew that I didn't have enough money to buy toiletries or whatever else that I needed. And they paid for my train fare they basically said, just stay at your parents now until it's time to go to Nigeria. They paid for my train fare to get to where I needed to be. They paid for a hotel for an overnight stay. They got a rental car so that I could then pick my colleague up. And then we drove down to Heathrow Airport and we then flew out to Nigeria. So they just cradled me and took care of that.
I want to say I love that you pointed out your supports that you had. It's very, very difficult to pull yourself out of this type of situation without supports. And
Absolutely.
I don't think we can stress that enough. Claire, I want to thank you for sharing your story with us today. I want to thank you for being so open and so honest. I appreciate every moment that you've shared. And to our listeners, I want you to remember that homelessness is not an identity. It is an experience that can happen to anyone. Mm-hmm. So, Claire, is there anything else you'd like to share with us before we end today?
No, I would just like to say thank you so much for inviting me on. It has been a privilege and very much almost like a therapy, because you and the listeners are the first people to hear this out loud, I guess. And don't let life define, what happens in life define you. Just allow it to make you stronger. Allow it to be a lesson and keep moving.
Claire, thank you so much for sharing your story with us today. To our listeners, it bears repeating that homelessness is not an identity. It's an experience that can happen to anyone. If you'd like to learn more or get involved, please visit www.formybonuschild.org. There you'll also find plenty of resources. Until next time, this is Gabby Cunningham, reminding you that every story matters, including yours.